welcome to the forum. We have a guest speaker today, and he's going to talk for a little while, and then he'll have time for questions. My name is Artis Rice. I'm on the Board of Christian Social Action. One of our committees is the Transition from Ministry Committee, and from Prison Committee, not from Ministry. Transition from Ministry would probably look a whole lot different here. So, but we're all friends. You know what I meant, right? Okay, and that is the committee that asked to have Alfredo come and speak. Some of the committee members had heard him speak at Drake, and then since then he has had a guest editorial in the Des Moines Register about black on black crime. So I've pretty much told him he can talk about whatever he wants to, and he would anyway. But I want to recognize that we have here this morning with us the president of the Iowa State Bar Association, the Honorable Henry Hamilton. So, Alfredo Parrish is a very well-known attorney in Des Moines. He's probably more well-known for his criminal work than his civil, but he does an unbelievable amount of non-criminal work also. Al's from Alabama, and he got up to Iowa to go to college at Loras, I believe.
Dubuque.
Dubuque?
Yeah.
University of Dubuque. Okay. I knew it was a Presbyterian. Okay.
We were surrounded by Catholics, but
Okay.
yeah.
So Al graduated from the University of Dubuque. He also went to the University of Iowa Law School, and also 3 of his 4 children graduated from the University of Iowa Law School. The other one went a more interesting path and is now studying nuclear physics.
Engineering, right? Yeah.
Nuclear engineering in California. Also here today is attorney Margaret Stewart, who is Al's wife. Margaret and her family were longtime Plymouth members. I asked Margaret if she ever sang in the choir, in Matten's choir, and she said a little bit, but both of their children did. Hamilton's only a few years out. He's graduated from college, but he was a longtime Matten's choir singer. Al has connections with some other people here in the room. He and Will Hookman were roommates, actually, in law school.
Not recently, in law school.
Yeah, in law school. Yes.
Because, well, you know.
Okay, so Al came to Des Moines and started working at Legal Aid. And Bob Oberbilling was his supervisor. There's Bob. Okay. And at one time, when Alfredo was an attorney there, Bob was also supervising former federal judge Bob Pratt and former judge Carla Foltz, and let's see, who else was there?
Tom Harkin.
Yes, former Senator Tom Harkin. So you can just get a picture of what those staff meetings might have been like back in the day. After Al worked at Legal Aid for a while, he opened his own firm, and he is the founding partner of the law firm Parrish and Criedenier. Their office is at 2910 Grand Avenue, just down the street. It's a big, old building. And how many attorneys do you have, Al?
15.
15 attorneys, okay. I'm not sure what else to say about you, except that Al and I have been friends for like 42 years. We worked together in civil rights starting in 1980. And I also worked in his office for about 5 years too. And he is an advocate. He's an advocate for his clients, sometimes to the irritation or dismay of the people that are opposing him. But he is the person, if you ever get in trouble, he's the one you want to call, okay? Alfredo.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Artis, for the invitation, and all my good friends I see here and people I've known as I go all the way back to Will. Henry and I worked together When he was a magistrate, he was in our office, and I could go on and on with. And Bob Oberbillig, I was writing some article the other day, and I was trying to figure out how do I fit Bob in, but the way I practice the attentiveness that I give to my clients, I owe that to Bob, and the fact that if you represent poor and indigent people, you don't lower yourself or do sloppier work or not be as prepared or have as nice an office. Bob taught me all of that when I first started working there. I will say one thing that I share with my kids is that my daughter just finished Iowa law school and started a huge firm in Minneapolis. And I told her when I was hired by Bob to come in with Bob Pratt and Tom Harkin and Bob Rush, and we can go on with all the great lawyers who came out of that office, is that I was the first lawyer to start with a 5-figure salary, and it was $10,200. And the other lawyers were very jealous, and they said, "We know why Bob Oberbillig paid you that kind of money, so we'll leave it at that, okay?" But it was a great class, and a lot of how I practice now I owe to Bob Oberbillig. And I was writing that out the other day to someone, trying to explain, maybe I was on a program with a KO or someone like that. But anyway, let me go to why I'm here. When artists asked me to come, I will tell you, it was about 2 to 3 months ago, and I was telling Margaret on the way here, when someone asks you 2 or 3 or 6, 8 months, yeah, okay, I'll be there. And then as you get closer, and she says, only 3 people will be there. I said, that's even better. Now I'm really nervous about this whole process. But let me get started. And I tried to merge the articles, the comments into what I thought was happening today, what has happened in Memphis. And I thought I would start with the good news and the bad news. One good thing about Iowa, we used to be number 1 or 2 in the country in terms of incarceration of minorities, but there was a statute passed in 2007. And in that statute is a racial impact statement. And what it does, every bill that comes before the legislature that involves criminal conduct, they now have to go through a racial impact. And there was and this bill is very, very helpful, but it's prospective in nature. It's not retroactive. So there has been a reduction. So Iowa now proudly is number 4, I think, in terms of incarceration of minorities in the United States. So that's part of the good news. But in Iowa, we make up 20% of the jail population. When I say we make up the African Americans, and still 25% of the prison population, where we only make up 3.8 to 4.1% of the total population. More good news. A new prosecutor has been elected. I don't know her, Graham is her name, but I was on a program about 3 weeks ago, and she called in and said she worked as a clerk in my office probably 25 years ago. And we didn't try to hire for her. There's Kathy Cookman, who was also a clerk in our office at one point. But we try to hire students, but I honestly don't remember her when she worked there, but she said she agreed with a lot of the things I was saying on the show about, it was a KO, the Representative Samad show, about criminal justice system. She didn't realize I just said let everybody out, but she said, but anyway, she said she'd agreed with most of the stuff that I said. But I have a philosophy about the criminal justice system. I hope that's synonymous with hers. One of the good news things is that she's going to stop arresting people with low-level marijuana crimes. I think that's an advantage because we know African Americans are arrested at 8 times the rate of whites, even though they equally use marijuana. So that's a good thing. I know some of the police officers, and I'll talk about that in a minute, who are in charge don't agree with that philosophy. But I'll talk to you about some of the things I think they do agree with, because I have been involved recently in some meetings with the chief, who I think has offered some really good solutions to some of the problems that we have going. The other day, I had a client call me and said, I want to get done with my driving while barred deal. This is a good news item. And I said, what's the problem? Why can't you get it done so we can get your deferred judgment taken care of in Mitchell County? And if you know anything about Mitchell County, it's the whitest county in Iowa, those of you who've never been there, but he happened to be an African-American who was picked up working on a campaign for the governor at the time. And so I was doing some pro bono work for him. And the long and short of it is that he said he can't get through to the program down in Polk County. And as you know, driving while barred basically is a poor person's crime. In Iowa City, Johnson County, Janice Linus, who was the prosecutor down there, basically suspended prosecuting people for driving while barred. Because it used to be the cops would wait on the people to drive up for their hearing dates, knowing that their license would be suspended, and they'd pick them up. But it should be a civil crime. And when I called down and says, what's the problem? Why can't you get in? They told me, and this was Friday, I think, the reason there's a holdup, she's lowering the entrance rate for this program. So that's a very positive sign to see things like that happening in Polk County. Let's talk a little bit about the bad news. And it's always good to prepare for speeches like this because it makes me go back and update myself about what's going on. And this is a very distressing statistic when I was preparing for my comments here. As of 2019, 811 prisoners under the age of 30 from Polk, Johnson, and Scott County are in prison serving life sentences. 509 of these prisoners are young black men. 509 of the 811. Now, let me give you something that you have to think about. As you know, during the pandemic, a lot of jury trials have been held up, right? So if a lot of jury trials have been held up, the other factor that's coming into play is that we know we've had a spike in inner city violence, a huge spike. As the chief and I were talking the other day in my office, and he's very instrumental and wants to do something about this, and I'll share some of those things with you. Last year, there were 22 homicides in Polk County, which is a decent number. Of those, 80 to 90% were African Americans killing other African Americans. There's no dispute about it. A lot of people don't like to talk about it, but it's a factor that we have to talk about if we're going to solve the problem, because my belief is that you have to identify the problem. It's a very complex problem, but then you try to work to try to solve it. So what do? But we also know by my call to the Polk County Attorney's Office in the last 3 years, 70% of all the homicides in the last 3 years have been black people killing other black people. But it's not just one black person who's a perpetrator. You also have to deal with the fact that they have buddies and friends who are participating in this act with them. So 2 to 3 of them might be going to prison. So what does that do with that statistic I just talked about? These kids are all under the age of 25, not under the age of 30. By the time they go through the criminal justice system, they might be 24, 25 because of the backlog of the first-degree murder cases. Just say if 50% of those folks were convicted, and the conviction rate is much higher. We know in federal court it's about 95%. State court, I would say about 75 to 80%. So what happens in that case? Well, I counted it up. Those 509 people who are under the age of 30 now, you add to that 15 people, but let's say we add 30 people to it. That's going to be 540 people who are African Americans serving life in prison. But not only that, you're going to have the other family members who are victims, who have young babies, who have kids, and who are locked into this process, who can't get out. So the perpetrator's family is locked in that cycle. And next, you have the victim's family locked in that cycle. So in this community, just like in all the other communities, we're going to have to find a way out. Now, the scary part, when I started meeting with this community group, the big thing was, well, what about Chicago? What about Los Angeles? What about New York? True, they have their own issues, but they're not sitting here with the 10% of the population being African American dealing with those type of issues. Not to say they're not horrific issues out there, but we have a unique and unusual problem here in Des Moines, Iowa. And that's when I debated heavily, should I call it black on black violence? And it's interesting to sit with the young African Americans in these meetings And they said, well, maybe we shouldn't, maybe we should call it inter-city violence, maybe we should call it something else. However we call it, it is what it is, and we have to deal with that. So what do I think is some of the additional bad news? When I wrote a law review article, and I joke about that because my daughter, who just graduated from Iowa, had a law review article published a year after she graduated, and I told Will and my other friends, it took me 50 years to get a law review article published. And so she's 50 years smarter than me, right? And I attribute that to her mom, nothing having to do with me. But anyway, in that article in 2019, in the Drake Law Review article, where we were, several of us, including Justice Katie, one of my heroes and friends, wrote about what has happened in 150 years, right, since the Alexander case came out, and we all know what that is. 35%, and this is where you have to really go with these numbers, not to throw a bunch of numbers out. 35% of the people serving mandatory minimum sentences in Iowa are African American. Now, 35% mandatory minimum, let me tell you the scary part of that. There's no probation, there's no parole, no early parole. You have to serve that time. It's not what I call a soft mandatory minimum sentence. It is a hard mandatory minimum sentence. Now, how does it apply? It applies when the prosecutor makes the decision to charge it in that manner. So if they charge, let's say, a robbery first, you're going to do 70% of that sentence, which is 17 years. No probation, no parole, no reduction in time. So that's the issue. And if it's a murder second, that's a 35-year sentence. It's not soft at all. Now, what that means, it used to be 85%, right? So the legislature and maybe our great Polk County supervisor was on when that was changed. I don't know. It was reduced to 70%. Most clients I deal with, particularly young African-American kids, will tell me, well, are they going to reduce it again? I said, well, have you seen the legislature lately? No, I don't tell them that. I'm not quite that smart, but obviously if they can pass a school bill like that, they're not going to turn around and reduce it to 50%, 60%. So that's the bad news. The other bad news is that our Supreme Court, and I hope no justices are here because I have to argue in front of them every now and then, has turned very conservative. When it started, obviously, when they voted out the 3 people on the court, and it's never changed back since then. And Justice Katie, untimely death, put us in a position where he would take the dissent on what I thought were critical social issues and issues dealing with race. We don't have that anymore. What I see about the court, and not to criticize them, they're all bright people, don't get me wrong, but they are more technical in how they look at things than are more compassionate. I don't see the compassion in any of these justices, not that they are not good people, that I used to see, and even the old court before we got these folks that they voted out on the bench. There's a big change in our court. And if you read the decisions that they have written on these critical issues, you don't see what I think would be the nuances to think that 3 or 4 years from now they're going to change. It's not going to happen. So if you can't look to the appellate court to correct these arguments, where are you going to have to look? And that's some of the bad news. Let me tell you how this ties into the issue of the interaction between police and young African Americans that starts this kind of diverse process. A couple of things you have to look at when you're reviewing this is there are many times when race will intervene in the judicial process. It starts from the time these kids are suspended from school and have to go to juvenile court. There's a time when the officers come in and arrest these young people. Then there is the detention process. The detention, do you detain them or you let them go? Well, if they've had a couple of juvenile matters, they're not going to be released. The opportunity for you to rehabilitate and be ready for sentencing is not going to happen if you're not released. At pretrial release, you have a group of people, and I don't know how many African Americans over there, but I think it's very few from my experience, so they're not going to get out on the pretrial release program. So what happens? That's why we're going to have 20% and a 4% population of these folks sitting in the prison. The next thing is the past criminal record. They have 2 or 3 things out on their record, and then they get into court, they are less likely to be released. So again, you're not going to have, and employees are less likely to hire them if they are released under these circumstances, because they're saying, well, I don't know if I can keep, even though jobs are plentiful. There's no reason why you can't go in and say, well, I have a job nowadays, because you can find a job, as I tell my clients, you can find a job somewhere. Then it goes into the charging decision. If you look at, and John Sarcone and I had brutal fights over his policies. I like the way John Sarcone hired minorities, because he had minority lawyers hired in his office. He has, and I told people over and over again in public, he was the best hiring a minority anywhere in the state of Iowa. He beat Tom Miller out. He beat any other office out. He had, and some of these prosecutors have gone on to be judges, and that's a good thing. However, his charging decisions, and the ones that have happened in Black Hawk County with Brian Williams, Scott County, Cedar Rapids to some extent with the county attorney there, they will take an African American in a charging decision and charge the mandatory minimum sentence. So you can see how that cycle starts. Once it's charged and you have 2 or 3 minor offenses, the chances of you getting a judge or a pre-sentence writer to write out something that's helpful to you is problematic. The other thing, and I addressed that in my law review article a few years ago, we do these by almost algorithms. And as you know nowadays, the algorithms have racism built into it. Let's say, for instance, a young African-American kid, they have a mother who has had a brush with the law, an uncle who's had a brush with the law. That is written into the pre-sentence report, and is also written into the algorithm. So and I've argued against those when I've had the opportunity to, so within those algorithms that tells a judge, are you more likely to reoffend, or you're less likely to reoffend? Well, if you have 2 or 3 people in your family who have contact with the criminal justice system, the less likely that you are going to get a recommendation of being a low recidivist rate, or a middle one, or a high one. So when I argue these cases, I try to stress to the judges, look what we have here. Look at the algorithms. And the Supreme Court at one point, probably about, I can't think of the case, probably about 8, 9 years ago, dealt with the fact that you can use these algorithms, but everybody uses them. Whether you're in Black Hawk County, Scott County, Lynn County, Polk County. So I've tried to encourage the prosecutors not to be so anxious to use the mandatory minimum sentences. The other thing about the mandatory minimum sentences, the judges in Iowa, some of the smartest people you ever want to meet, don't have discretion. So once that case comes in front of them, they have no choice but to send them to prison. One of the suggestions I made is try to give judges more discretion. Now, in robbery second, I don't get too technical here, there is some discretion where you can do in prosecuted charges decision, it's a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years, where you have to serve 7 years before you're released. So if you're negotiating this, why can't you give a judge the discretion to lower to 2.5 years if this kid looks like they have been out, been working, have a family that's going to support them when they come back in? So that's one of the ways that I think you can modify this system. But if you don't modify it, it's fairly horrific, and the sentencings are pretty draconian. Am I running into my 10 minutes? Go ahead. Artists will stop me and I will agree with whatever she says.
You mentioned that there is a group forming in Des Moines to help with some of these problems. Do you want to just tell about that group now before we start questions?
I do. Let me briefly tell you how it started and what we're trying to do in our ultimate goal. Actually started with Akil Samad, the representative, and the chief of police. They wanted to meet to discuss the rise in the violence based upon the position I'd taken a couple of years ago. They came by my office. We expanded now, probably about 15, 20 people in the community. Terry Caldwell Johnson, the new county attorney's first assistant, Justin Allen. So we've been meeting, and the chief had this idea. I think it's a brilliant idea. As a matter of fact, we've gotten $25,000 for the Prairie Meadows, and they're going to start producing PSAs. when the chief came up with the idea, my thought is it's a great idea. Do PSAs where you can, the problem is you're not reaching these young people on television. You're not reaching them in the newspaper. So we have some people who are going to help us put it on all the social platforms. And we're going to try to produce 6 to 8 to 10, I think is their goal, 10 PSAs. And these PSAs will have the chief talking or someone from his office. It's hard, if you know, to get the chief on TV or in a video, but he's committed to do that. Matter of fact, I have to tell you, he's been instrumental in getting the funds for these kids to do that. Terry Caldwell Johnson's going to administer the funds. Carl Voss has been instrumental, so is Connie Bozen in getting those funds. But it's actually, as I said, the chief pushing this, and it's his idea. His idea, and the people who are going to be producing this are young African-American men, Bo James and B. Wells. You may have heard of those people. They're very active in the community. There's a young coach at North, Julian Say. These are just wonderful young men, and I think these are the people you're going to have to get involved, because these are the people these young knuckleheads will listen to. So they are going to put together their PSAs. They're going to reach out to them to listen on all the social platforms, whether it's Snapchat. When my article was out the other day, they called me and they says, don't worry, Al, we got you covered. This is out all over the community. And so our hope is to have these PSAs ready by the 20th. The register is going to be prepared to give these young folks some interviews. They're going to have actually some of the young men in the community help produce the videos. And what we hope to have is the chief speaking to them, these 3 young men or 4 young men, however they want to be, speaking to these other young men who are involved in this activity to stop it. We're going to have, we're trying to get KCCI and WHO to give us some clips of what I call victim impact statements, because they're so powerful. You see them on television. These are the most powerful things. They've been developed to great techniques now to influence the judges, but they may influence some young parent also to talk to their kid if they see him with a firearm or something like that. I am doing a section on firearms. I have all the research done, but reducing it to the fact of, oh, if you have a gun, you're going to be in big trouble, you know, to get them to understand that in a short clip. That's going to be hard to do, because they're going to do it to 1 minute to 3 minute clips. And so we're going to have those ready to be distributed all over the community. I understand from the U.S. Attorney, they are doing a project similar to this in Davenport and a project in Minneapolis. I have not been able to touch bases with those people, but that's what we're trying to do. But we've been meeting about once a week and break it down into committees, but hopefully we'll have the writing done, and they're going to produce it and hire people from this seed money that we have to help produce these projects. All I would say is that when you see this come out and you see them, well, need a few more bucks, follow that and get to the people. There is no name for this community group, but the chief has been one of our big proponents. At one point in the meeting, he says, I'm just tired of seeing these dead bodies. And you see that across the table, and there are 3 or 4 other young African-American men sitting there. The message resonates as to his sincerity. Now, we know there's a lot of distrust within the community of police departments. What I try to do in those meetings is sit back, let these folks interact with each other, and see can we find some common ground to get this message out. So I've been basically being a facilitator in this. But when we see this incident as happening, I mentioned to a couple of people in Memphis, it is troublesome. But if you look at a couple of articles that have been written, Margaret sent me one this morning, there's one in the Washington Post, about the fact that we have to recognize the fact that these were African-American police officers doing this to African-Americans. And nobody wants to deal with that. It's very difficult to deal with this very complex subject. And is it cultural? Is it racial? Is the fact that these young officers have lost track of the fact that these other young Black people don't deserve the type of protection that we see for whites, let's see, in the same situation, and we're just not getting it? Or have we dehumanized African Americans to the extent that we think it's okay to do that? Nobody wants to talk about it. But in order to solve it, you got to identify it. You got to identify it, and then you got to address it. And I'm telling you, there is some complex, difficult issue with why so many African Americans are killing so many African Americans. There's something we can't put our finger on, particularly when it shows up in a community like this. Sure.
I'm not sure that, you can hear me? Okay. I promised that there would be time for questions. Who has a question?
Okay. I just want to know, I'm not under oath, okay? So
No, but we are taping this.
I'm in trouble.
First of all, Alfredo, thank you so much for coming to share your information and to raise higher the concerns that you've talked about. I appreciate that. I have a question that you may or may not want to answer if you
Sure.
even have any information about it, but I'd like to know if you have any thoughts on steps that, as a practical matter, can be taken by police officers in their implementation of the work that they do, that will both respect the rights of the people that may be charged, the people that they're going after, so to speak, on the one hand, and also balance with that the necessity of protecting the police officers from the very serious risks that they take in doing their work to enforce the law. I don't know whether or not you know of any steps like that that might be taken, which are not being taken now, or even whether you want to respond to the question, but that's my question.
No, Jay, I'm happy to respond to that. That's an interesting question because the thing you have to deal with, knowing that there are suspicions within the African-American inner city community on police officers across a long history, and this incident in Memphis won't help at all.
Excuse me,
Right.
By the way,
Mhm.
sorry, I didn't mention this. My question was not born out of racial conflict.
Right, I get it, I get it. But you got to start with that context because that's where the problems blow up. So my thought is this. One thing that I saw over the weekend, Chief Wingert issued his own statement about this incident. If you haven't seen it, it's a pretty decent statement to take a look at. I think he's committed to this idea of adding integrity. And you know, there is a female African-American who was appointed and moved up the chain at the police department, who I think, you know, as they say, just getting you in the room gives you a different perspective, people from different and diverse backgrounds. The other thing I think, there is a huge breakdown, I think, within the young people and the police department. I don't know how that trust is going to be restored. I think it can start, though, with the type of community interaction that we've started here that I think is existing in other programs. Representative Samad has a good program that's going where he works with the police. This young man who was shot, Will Keeps, has an excellent program. He and the chief have interaction. He grew up where he had a history of engaging in misconduct, but that trust has to be established. I think the chief said he's 2 years away from being out. I think he's going to do everything he can to, in our community, to get that started. But in an overall scale, where you have a mayor like the mayor in New York, he and I kind of align along the same position. The people who are really hurt are the inner city people by this rising crime, right? If you look at the crime rates in Memphis, had shot up from 21, 22 right after the pandemic hit, and these weapons start spreading around. The question, but there's a missing link here. The missing link is that even when they start investigating these crimes, there's mistrust and people won't cooperate. That's a huge breakdown amongst young people, not just African Americans, but young people too. So that's going to have to be reestablished. How do you do it? I don't know. Do you need more personnel to make it work? Do you need more police personnel? One thing that came out in this meeting one day, just listening to young men talk, they said, well, we know at any point in time, if they wanted to have the kind of force that, say, occurred in Memphis, and that was before Memphis occurred, that could happen. But nobody wants that to happen. It's just going to make it worse. So are there other techniques? I don't know, but I think we have to start somewhere. And as long as we start, I think we'll find some solutions to some of these problems. Mm-hmm. Sure.
Bob?
You're going to finally tell them why you only paid me $10,200 to
No,
start?
no, I'm not. I couldn't pay you enough. Al worked twice as hard as anybody else. Al, one of the things, if you remember, that we had the first public defender program in Iowa through the Legal Aid Society.
Right.
And one of the things that we did was that it didn't make any difference what time of day or night our client got arrested. We were there. You were there, I was there at 2 o'clock in the morning, whatever it was, to get him out of jail.
Right.
That the statistics are clear that people that are out of jail are less likely to get the maximum sentence. All kinds of bad things happen if you're sitting in jail. And yet our public defender now doesn't do anything about pre-trial. They got to wait till they get appointed. The Drake Legal Clinic does the same thing. Is there any effort being made to change those rules to get the public defender's office immediately involved when a person gets arrested?
That's a great point. I had a kid from Nebraska call me last week, a kid I had helped out here. And he says, hey, I'm in some trouble, blah, blah, blah. I called the public defender's office. I said, it's the same as here. You cannot get anybody to help you until you get arrested. No advice. You go to a private office, you got to pay money, or you got to have someone who will do pro bono work. That's an excellent point. In my suggestion 2 years ago, I wrote that, number one, we need better pay. We need a better training program for these folks. In state court, folks, they only pay $50 to $55 an hour with no paralegal, no travel for public defenders if you are working on a poor person's case. In the federal system, I just got a notice because I am on the CJA panel. In federal court, you get $165 an hour. You can hire an expert up to $2,500 without even calling anybody. You can get an investigator starting on your case. State court is so different. And you may have heard the debate when Chief Justice gave her State of the Union message. We have crisis in two areas. One is they've dropped from 1,100 people who are willing to defend poor people to 500 people in the state of Iowa who are willing to do that outside of the public defender system. That is horrific. Years ago, it used to be a lot better, but when you are down to 500 lawyers who can defend poor people, you wonder why so many of them go to prison. And minorities often have to use public defenders to defend themselves. But that's a critical juncture, Bob, that you bring up. And that is, if you can't get to a lawyer when something first happens, your case is going to go down from there. There is no real upside if you can't have legal advice from day one. Can they do something? The legislature, I believe, could, in their bill, if they consider raising the rates for public defenders and for private lawyers who work outside of the system, what you can do is say, okay, let them turn in their bills, let them get over to see their client, turn in their bill afterwards, and we're going to accommodate you. What you do, even if you got a lawyer who went out to help you, you turn in your bill later. If you're not signed on the contract, they won't pay you. And they won't pay you paralegal. I mean, it's just unbelievable where Iowa has drifted. And I think if you haven't, go back, look at the Chief Justice's State of the Judiciary meeting. And I know Henry and I had breakfast not too long ago. We were talking about exactly the same thing. The fact that the public defender system is in a mess in Iowa. It's never been this bad. And the jails are going to fill up if we don't start getting better pay for these folks, because they're not going to do it. Nobody's going to come in and turn in a deficit bill at the end of the time they're representing someone on these serious crimes. See what happened in the 1970s when the crime rate started spiraling? The legislature starts meeting and they started putting these draconian statutes in place. 1990s, the crime rate dropped. And I blame Democrats as well as Republicans for it too. I mean, we know Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, they did this stuff. And then once they stopped, and Justice Manfield told me the last time we were chatting, he said, Al, you know what happened? Iowa legislature never adjusted themselves to the drop in the crime rate. And so we have these draconian penalties now, even though the crime rate is leveling out, and these kids are never going to get out of prison. And when they get out, like one said the other day at a meeting we were in, he'd never even known what a cell phone. He went going to his job out in West Des Moines. He went to the quick shop to try to use the payphone. I mean, that's when you've been in prison for 17 years. Look at the technology we've had to adjust to. I'm still not adjusted to it, but so look at what we have to adjust to get it done.
Sheena, you've been waiting.
Yeah, I know that Just Voices is concerned about the SET team, the special enforcement team that gets ramped up for the summer months.
Right.
And that seems to be kind of like the Scorpion team in Memphis,
Right.
and causing a lot of arrests as they wait in inner city neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
So what's Chief Wingert doing about that?
Well, that's a good question. Matter of fact, we had a group a couple of years ago that was set up to try to deal with it on a quicker basis. We had Kevin Vanderskill from the U.S. Attorney's Office, several other people who would meet from the school district as the summer was leading in. And ICAO has said, look, if you think we're having a tough time this winter, wait until the summer comes about. I don't think we can, even though the inner city is mostly impacted by the crime, I don't think you're going to be able to build trust by sending in these kind of SWAT teams to deal with these problems. But they are serious problems. I think sometimes, I'll tell you a quick anecdote, folks. 25 years ago, or 30 years ago, when Harlan Lemon and Bob Oberle was talking about this, you could go in and talk to these young kids and ask them, well, you don't want to be in trouble, do you? You want to get out and get a job? I tell you, the conversations nowadays is so bad. There's such a disconnect that I have never seen anything like this before in terms of talking to these young kids. I had a young kid in federal court the other day, and it was in front of Judge Rose. He's been sentenced already. It's all public record, so I'm not saying anything out of school. But he was 24 years old. He had been arrested and had documented encounters with the court 16 times. 16 times. And so when I was arguing this case, telling the judge, is there some hope for this young man? And she said, well, Mr. Parrish, I've dropped 5 of your, I've agreed to 5 of your arguments that 5 things he shouldn't be sentenced on. But they start with little things like stealing from Hy-Vee, a liquor bottle, and then it's stealing a package of cigarettes, and you go into court without a lawyer and you plead guilty to it, and you don't put you in a program, and you have a little drug program attached to that. That's where it starts. So my answer to your question is, a SWAT team doesn't solve those kind of problems. When this kid gets to be the age now where he's caught with 3 firearms, and 1 an automatic, with these magazines that hold 30 bullets or something, they're in big trouble at that point because those criminal history points add up. Intervention, if anything, has to be started at an earlier age, at 14, 15, 16 years old. Now, years ago, and Margaret knows this, I wrote this article, then don't go back and read it because I asked for some harsh things. I said, I'm at the point where I think perhaps we should forget about one generation and just start focusing on can we improve the next. I didn't get a lot of, pats on the back for that article, but, at one point I was but I think there is some hope here. I think things have changed and improved, but going in there with a SWAT team is not going to make the difference.
Alfredo,
Sure.
there's only about 3.5 minutes till church starts.
Oh, we'll
And
forget about that, folks.
Okay. Okay, so
I'm
so
giving
you're
them
gonna
the
lead
gospel.
you're gonna lead us in song here. And part of these people, I assume, haven't been to church yet. So on behalf of the Board of Christian Social Action, I want to thank you for being here today.
Thank you for
And-
the invite.
We might invite you back.